Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. When you see a woman who has been single for several years, what is the first thing most people think? She is independent. She is focused. She is building something. She knows her worth and she is not willing to settle. That is the dominant cultural narrative. It is celebrated, it is reinforced, and it is genuinely respected in most social environments. Now ask the same question about a man. When you see a man who has been single for several years, what is the first thing most people think? Something must be wrong with him. He is immature. He is commitment phobic. He is emotionally unavailable. He is hiding something. He cannot keep a relationship together. That is also the dominant cultural narrative. And the contrast between those two framings did not emerge by accident. It was constructed piece by piece over decades through media, through social conditioning, through institutional messaging, and through the quiet reinforcement of peer group consensus. Today, we are going to examine that construction honestly, not to generate conflict between men and women, because this is not a conflict story. It is a systems story. It is about how narratives are built, who builds them, what purposes they serve, and what it actually means for the single men navigating a social environment that has been subtly programmed to view their autonomy as a problem. Start with the foundational principle that most people never stop to examine. Attraction and social perception do not exist in a vacuum. They do not emerge purely from individual experience or direct personal observation. They are filtered, shaped, and in many cases constructed by the cultural environment that surrounds every person from the earliest stages of development. The media you consume, the messages your peer group reinforces, the framing you absorbed from family and institutions before you were old enough to evaluate it critically. All of these inputs combine to create a lens through which individual people and their choices are perceived and judged. And the lens, not the individual, is often doing most of the evaluative work. The principle here is straightforward. Repetition becomes reality. When a particular narrative about a category of people is repeated consistently across enough channels over enough time, it stops feeling like a narrative. It starts feeling like obvious truth. And once something feels like obvious truth, people stop questioning it. They simply apply it automatically and without examination to every individual who fits the category the narrative describes. The category in this case is the single man, and the narrative that has been built around him, reinforced across decades of media representation, cultural messaging, and social convention, is one of deficiency. The single man past a certain age is framed as someone who has failed to achieve something, as someone whose singleness reveals a character flaw rather than a deliberate choice, as someone to be suspicious of, to project onto, and to view through a lens of instability rather than one of intentionality. To understand how that narrative got built, it helps to look at what it replaced. For most of human history, male value was evaluated primarily through the lens of provision and social stability. A man's worth in the eyes of his community and in the eyes of potential partners was assessed by his ability to provide resources, protect a household, and demonstrate reliability through sustained commitment. Marriage was the primary signal through which those qualities were made legible. The married man was, almost by definition, a man who had been evaluated, selected, and validated by at least one person willing to stake their own security on his reliability. The unmarried man carried no such social proof. His qualities were unverified by the most trusted mechanism available. In that historical context, male singleness created genuine ambiguity, not hostility, but uncertainty. And uncertainty, when people are making decisions about trust and resource allocation, tends to generate caution. That caution was understandable in a world where the stakes of misplaced trust were genuinely high and where the available information for evaluating a stranger's character was limited. The social suspicion surrounding the unmarried man had a functional origin. What has changed is not the underlying psychological mechanism. What has changed is the world around it. The material conditions that made the married man's stability signal genuinely meaningful have largely dissolved. Individual economic survival is no longer dependent on household partnership in the way it once was. The institutional structures that reinforce marriage as the only viable path to social legitimacy have weakened considerably, and yet, the psychological residue of the old evaluation framework persists, carried forward not by material necessity, but by narrative repetition. And that is where the media dimension becomes impossible to ignore. The cultural representation of the single man across film, television, advertising, and now social media has been remarkably consistent in its framing. The bachelor archetype that dominates popular culture is the irresponsible man-child who refuses to grow up, the emotionally stunted loner who cannot form real connections, the man who avoids commitment because he is afraid of it, not because he has made a deliberate and considered choice about how to structure his life. These portrayals are not random. They reflect and reinforce a particular narrative about what male singleness means, and they do so in contrast to a parallel narrative about female independence that frames exactly the same structural situation. A person who has not entered long-term partnership in entirely opposite terms. The female independence narrative is celebratory. It frames the single woman as someone who has chosen herself, who has prioritized her own growth and development, who has refused to accept less than she deserves. The male singleness narrative is pathologizing. It frames the single man as someone who has failed to meet a standard, who is avoiding something he should be pursuing, who represents a risk rather than a potential. The asymmetry is stark, and it shapes perception in ways that most people never consciously examine. Now, why does this asymmetry exist and who does it serve? This is where the institutional dimension becomes relevant. Pair bonding and household formation are not just personal choices, they are economic engines. The formation of a new household generates predictable and substantial consumer spending across housing, furniture, appliances, services, insurance, and 100 downstream categories. The merger of two incomes into a shared domestic unit creates financial behaviors and dependencies that are deeply embedded in the economic infrastructure of consumer societies. Institutions ranging from the financial services industry to the advertising complex to various governmental structures all benefit from the reliable formation of paired households. The single person, particularly the single man with genuine financial discipline and reduced consumption needs, represents a disruption to those predictable patterns. This does not require a coordinated conspiracy. It does not require that any individual, executive, or media decision maker sat down and decided to stigmatize male singleness as a strategy for increasing household formation. It simply requires that the incentive structures of the institutions producing cultural content consistently reward narratives that frame partnership as the default correct choice, and that those repeated framings accumulate over time into the ambient cultural assumption that a man who has not chosen partnership has failed at something important. The peer group reinforcement mechanism adds another layer to this dynamic. The messages that circulate through female social networks about single men are not primarily generated by individual malice. They are the product of a shared narrative framework that has been absorbed from the surrounding culture and is then amplified through the consensus building process that tight social groups naturally engage in. When enough voices in a social environment consistently frame the single man as suspect, the individual members of that group face a social cost for dissenting from the consensus. It is easier and more socially comfortable to adopt the shared frame than to challenge it. And so the narrative perpetuates itself through social contagion, independent of whether any individual in the group has actually formed a negative judgment based on personal experience. This is not unique to how women talk about single men. It is a universal feature of how social groups form and maintain shared beliefs. But it is worth naming clearly because the man on the receiving end of that social consensus often experiences it as personal rejection or hostility when it is actually something more impersonal and more systemic. Understanding the mechanism does not eliminate the impact, but it changes what the impact means, and it changes how an intelligent man should respond to it. The psychology of what happens when a man genuinely does not need social validation is also worth examining carefully because it connects to why autonomous men sometimes generate discomfort that gets expressed through negative narratives. The man who has built genuine financial stability, genuine social independence, and genuine emotional self-sufficiency is, by definition, harder to influence through the mechanisms that social pressure normally relies on. He cannot be motivated by the fear of social exclusion because he has built a life that functions without the approval he is being threatened with withholding. He cannot be steered by the anxiety of being seen as deficient because he has a clear enough sense of his own value that the narrative does not stick. That kind of independence is genuinely unsettling to anyone who has unconsciously relied on the leverage that social pressure provides. Not because the independent man is hostile or threatening in any direct sense, but because his existence disrupts the assumption that everyone needs the same things in the same way, and that those shared needs can be used to motivate predictable behavior. The man who does not need your validation is the man you cannot easily move. And the man you cannot easily move tends to generate narratives about why his inability to be moved is a character defect rather than a strength. What does this mean practically for the single man navigating this environment? Several things, and they are worth stating directly. First, expect a projection. The narrative exists, it is ambient, and it will be applied to you by people who have absorbed it without examining it. That is not personal, it is systemic. Treating it as personal and responding to it emotionally, whether through defensiveness or bitterness or the performance of resentment, confirms the narrative rather than dissolving it. The man who gets angry at being misread is performing exactly the emotional instability the narrative predicted. The man who remains calm, clear, and indifferent to the misreading is demonstrating something that the narrative has no framework for. And that demonstration is more powerful than any argument. Second, understand that you cannot debate a narrative into irrelevance. You can only outperform it. The single man who is visibly stable, who is clearly building something, whose life demonstrates competence and direction and genuine self-possession, is not a man who fits the archetype the narrative describes. And people who encounter enough evidence against a narrative eventually update their perception, not because they were argued with successfully, but because the evidence made the narrative impossible to apply without obvious distortion. Third, and perhaps most importantly, do not absorb the conditioning that was designed for you. Men are also conditioned by the same cultural environment. The messaging that equates male worth with relationship status, that frames solitude as inherently suspect, that ties self esteem to the achievement of partnership milestones, that conditioning affects men too. The man who has internalized the idea that his singleness represents a failure is not just dealing with external judgment. He is dealing with a version of the narrative that lives inside his own head. Identifying that conditioning, naming it clearly, and choosing whether it reflects your actual values or simply the values that were installed without your consent, that is the real work. The broader philosophical frame here is important to hold on to. This is not a story about men versus women. The women who have absorbed narratives about single men are not enemies. They are participants in the same cultural conditioning system, receiving different inputs but shaped by the same basic mechanism. The goal is not to generate resentment in either direction. The goal is to see the system clearly enough that you can navigate it without being governed by it. Being single is not an anti-social position. It is not a statement against love or connection or the genuine value of shared life. It is a neutral positioning, a stage or a choice or a deliberate construction of a particular kind of life that deserves to be evaluated on its actual merits rather than through the lens of a narrative that was built to serve purposes that have nothing to do with any individual man's actual character or value. Love, when it is chosen freely and entered from genuine strength rather than social pressure, is a completely different thing from partnership entered because the alternative carried too much social cost. The man who chooses the former is making a genuinely human decision. The man who chooses the latter is managing his reputation. And the cultural confusion between those two things, enforced through narratives that pathologize the absence of partnership rather than celebrating the quality of its presence, is one of the more significant costs that the system imposes on everyone inside it. Build your value, build your stability, build the quiet certainty that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're building, independent of whether the surrounding culture has a flattering narrative for what that looks like. The perception will adjust. It always adjusts to sustained reality, eventually. But more importantly, the man who has genuinely outgrown the frame, who no longer needs the frame to evaluate himself, does not wait for the adjustment. He has already moved past the need for it. Do not fight the narrative. Outgrow it. That is the only response that actually works.